episode of Tinfoil Tells. I'm your host, Brandon. Tonight we're going to be joined by my guest, Shane Jones from Inquiries of Our Reality podcast and also Bizarre Encounters podcast. We talked about a lot of interesting topics. But before we jump into the discussions with Shane, if you've ever had an experience or a story you'd like to share on Tinfoil Tells, you can send an email to tinfoiltellspodcast@gmail.com. We'll get you scheduled for a future episode. I have a paranormal convention that I'll be setting up a booth at on October 21st in Miami County, Indiana. So if you're into stuff like that and you would like to come out and see all the cool things going on, you can do that. It's completely free and it's all ages. It's called Para-Unity 5. It'll be at the 4-H Fairgrounds in Miami County. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, X, all the social medias we're out there on. Again, I pretty much hate social media, so I'm not very active on it. But if you would like to get a hold of me, the easiest way would probably be through Facebook or send an email. That's the best way to get a response from me. I'm always looking for more guests, always looking for people that's got some interesting topics they'd like to talk about, any experiences they'd like to share. So it's definitely appreciated to anyone out there that wants to come on here and talk with me about it. If you'd really like to help the podcast out, you can continue to share it around. Word of mouth helps this grassroots movement keep going for the podcast. We're starting to pick up some speed, so I definitely appreciate all the help from everyone out there. Please leave a review. If you leave a 5-star review, it helps with the rankings, so that makes it more visible for other people to find the podcast, so that definitely helps out too. But we're going to go ahead now and bring Shane on in, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take the time tonight to welcome my guest Shane to the show. Thanks for coming out and talking with me.
It's an absolute pleasure, man. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Hey, not a problem. Glad you could make it out. So, would you like to let the audience know where you're from, like what you do, a little bit of background about you?
So let's see, starting from the beginning, this might be a little bit of a long story, but I'll kind of feed it through to kind of explain how I got into the position that I'm currently in, I guess.
Sure.
I'm from Michigan. Obviously, I'm a podcaster, as most of you would probably assume at this point. Originally, when I started my show, I was listening to a lot of podcasts at the time. I was like the really quiet guy. I didn't talk to a lot of people at work, but my mind was always just racing about all these just different weird concepts and crazy things going on. But I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and I kind of felt that they didn't really like ask the type of questions that I would typically ask. So I ended up deciding one day, like, hey, man, I'm going to start a podcast. Like, I'm just going to do it. So I ended up starting this podcast, which was my first one, was Inquiries of Our Reality, which is a very fitting name because I question everything like within this reality. And so I started building that one up, and that one kind of became more of like a open-minded talk show, I guess is the best way to describe it, where I dig into anything fringe, but it's more just open conversation style, like not anything scripted. It kind of just goes wherever it happens to go. If I have a guest on that are like a scientist or a researcher, there's a lot more questions involved. But what I try to do with a lot of my guests before they leave the show is I like to expand on theories, throw my theories into the mix, and not just do like the typical interview like everybody would do. Like a lot of the researchers that have come on, they say that they like the fact that I like contribute ideas to what they're saying, and I don't just kind of just let them go with just the typical type of interview, because I always like to be able to throw in new information, have a researcher on, and maybe they see something in a new light, try to expand on the research and not just do the typical interview like they do with everybody else. Like I'll purposely go and listen to other shows that they've been on, so I can try to steer it into like a totally different direction so that it's a little bit more refreshing for the guests. And it also makes it so that, you see a podcast where, there'll be a guest that's on like 10 different podcasts, and it's kind of the same interview for each of them. Mm-hmm. But what I try to do is just have it different than all of those. So it's like, you can listen to a guest that I have on my show that's been on 10 other shows, but it's going to be a different interview than those 10 other ones, just because I try to do it a little bit different. Like if I hear that they're regularly talking about a certain specific topic, I try to change it up and just try to make it something different for them. But I was running that for a while. I'm still currently obviously doing that show. But I wanted to kind of bring in a different facet of what I do. So because of the way that show kind of turned out, where it was the open-minded conversation show, didn't really leave me room for doing like my deep dives and my research and all the other weird stuff that I dig into. So at that point, I kind of felt that I needed to start another podcast so that I can kind of have both assets. I could have, or aspects. I could have my one side where it's just like the open conversation, and then the other side I can do my own personal research. So out of that, obviously I've been really big into the whole cryptids, folklore, aliens, ghosts, like all that kind of stuff in particular. So I ended up starting another podcast called Bizarre Encounters with this guy named Ghost from My Third Eye. We ended up running that show for a couple months or so. And then he ended up taking a hiatus from the show. Nothing personal, nothing like that. No beef or anything between the guy. He just was doing another show at the time with a guy named Ryan from Dangerous World. And he wanted to focus on all of that. And Ghost is definitely more of like a conspiratorial news, I guess, type of podcaster is the best way to describe it. Like he's really, really good at what he does. But not as much into like the cryptids and the folklore stuff. Like originally, obviously, he's interested in Sasquatch and things like that. But when the show started getting like really deep into stuff, he just wasn't really his forte, I guess you could say. But half the battle with a lot of these things is I kind of believe that everything happens for a reason. So because of me doing the show with him for a while, it kind of set it up where I had this show already and I wanted to continue it going on because it was obviously like the other side of my work that I do. And I wanted to be able to continue it. So I ended up putting out this post, basically saying that I was looking for a new co-host. I ended up getting blown up with people to the point where it was like a little bit stressful to the, like, I didn't really know how to like weed through these people. So I started setting up shows with them to come on like inquiries and stuff, just trying to kind of get a feel for people. But probably like an hour or two after I did that post, I ended up thinking in my head, like, I already know who I want to be on the show. It was this guy that I recently did a show with on inquiries. His name is Oren Felix. He usually he goes on Instagram as the Framework UFO. And we just had a really, really good back and forth, a really, really good dynamic. So I ended up shooting him a message and basically asking him if he was interested in being my co-host. And he was like, absolutely. So we ended up setting that all up. Everything went really, really smooth. And then we ended up adding his girlfriend into the show. And that ended up being like a perfect dynamic. So then I kind of became the like folklore encrypted guy. Like obviously we all kind of cover all bases, but we all have our specialty that we really like. So I was the folklore encrypted guy. Oren was the UFO alien guy, and then Jenny was the person that got into like the paranormal and all that kind of stuff. And again, we all kind of bounce across that, like all of those for sure, but we have like our specialty. So then we ended up having this like weirdly perfect dynamic that fell into place that we kind of feel had one person for each topic of like the weird phenomenon that was going on. And they originally weren't like podcasters or anything like that by any means. So like the first couple episodes, they kind of were a little bit nervous, didn't really know exactly how to handle doing interviews, things like that. So we started rolling with that for a little bit. They kind of fell into the shoes. Orrin and Jenny finally were like, oh yeah, this is our show too. After I told them that like a million times, like, this isn't my show that you guys are co-host on. This is all of our shows. So after that, we kind of pushed it more into doing a lot more deep dives and research, which is kind of where we're at currently, where we did like a big Michigan Dogman 4-part series. We just actually finished the Jack Parsons series that we're working on. That one was all Warren. He was killing it over there with that one. We ended up doing like the Whitsville UFO encounter. We have a Squonk episode that's coming up soon that I was working on, but yeah, it just kind of continued on and progressed from there. So now I end up running 2 podcasts. So I have Inquiries About Reality, which is the open-minded talk show. And then I have Bizarre Encounters, which is like the deep dive that I do with my 2 co-hosts that we have fun. We joke along the way. And then because of having 2 podcasts, I kind of felt that I needed to kind of make like an overhead for both of them. So from there, I started Open Minds Media, which is, I guess the best way to describe it is like my podcast production company. And I've just kind of been expanding from there ever since. I recently got a new camera that I finally wanted to start working on. So I'm going to start taking some of my episodes and turning them into like documentaries. Oren and I are both currently working on some books, and we want to eventually get to a point where we can start Open Minds Media Publishing. So yeah, we keep expanding our name, keep expanding our brand. And we've just been doing everything we can in the process and having fun along the way. And here I am almost 2 years later. Show's continuing to grow, still expanding into other forms of media, but I'm enjoying it every step of the way. Hoping one day eventually I can maybe take the time to do all this full time, because I am currently working a full-time job as a cannabis cultivator on top of running the two shows and on top of being a dad. So it's like having three full-time jobs, but I make it all work and I have a lot of fun in the process. And I really hope all the listeners out there really enjoy the content that I put out because I definitely enjoy making it.
It is definitely hard to do a podcast and be a dad and have a full time job, let alone two podcasts, because I also have two podcasts. I have this one, and then I have one that's completely not the same as this one. I have one that's called Dark Side of the Scene, which is basically where me and a co host interview fellow musicians about the bad stuff they've encountered while being on the road, like in a band, like some of the shady venues, bad band members, stuff like that, like the horror stories that you don't really hear about what musicians go through. So that's kind of my other thing, because I've also been in a metal band. So for 20 something years, I've been in bands. So it's like me and this other guy, we've been in bands. Like we know all the stuff that goes on, but I don't feel like the average person knows what goes on. So we kind of do that as well. But
You talking about like the dark occult side of stuff or just like crazy stories that happen on the road and stuff? Or
yeah, kind of like just the crazy stuff. Not so much. We haven't dived into anyone with a cold. I've tried to press those issues with certain people, but no one's wanted to bring that up.
of course, they got
But
to keep it all secret. It's behind closed eyes or eyes wide shut, whatever the phrase is.
no,
But
we
I guess
just
you kind of get what I'm talking about with
yeah.
the like, you have multiple facets and you need to put it in multiple places. Like, I don't know how
Mhm.
people just rock one podcast and have all of their stuff in one place. It's like, there's multiple different things that I'm interested in. It's like, it's better to
No,
have multiple podcasts. Otherwise, you're just mashing everything into one place and
no,
it doesn't fit right, you know?
no. And then I got the book that came out, the Tinfoil Tales book, that I just took basically the transcripts from some of the interviews and just put them in written format and put that book up for sale on Amazon. Basically, it's just same as the interview. It's just text versions. I mean, it is what it is, but
I
some
mean, it's a
people
good
like to
idea,
read.
honestly, because it's almost like having like an encounter book in a way, which is
Yeah,
kind of what I'm working on in a way is like an encounter book with like research after it. Which also throwing it out there to any of the listeners out there, if anybody has any weird stories that they possibly want featured in a book, come at me with your stories. Just want to plug that one and throw that in there real quick. Because I try to mention that on any show because I'm trying to collect weird encounters. And for anybody that does throw anything in, my intention is when the book releases, may have to pay for shipping depending on how many people release the stories. But anybody that throws in stories in the book, my intention is to give you a copy of the book. And you just have to pay for preferably shipping, or I'll figure it out depending on how many people included in there. But yeah, currently something I'm also working on too.
if you do it through Amazon, which I don't know where you're planning on having it published at, I think it's like ends up being if you buy books from them yourself without selling them, like you get author books. I think they only sell them to you depending on how many pages it is. It ends up being like about $6 a book.
Well, it's not too bad. I've heard a lot of people say horror stories about Amazon as far as them taking like 90% of your profits.
Oh yeah, you don't
Um,
make shit for money, but
yeah, I was thinking about self-publishing when I get to that point. I have a few strings to pull for other people that are publishers, guests that I've had on the show that are able to they know the way around that kind of stuff. Part of the perks of starting a podcast, I'm sure you're fully aware of, is that you have a guy for everything. It's kind of nice.
yeah, the whole reason I got into podcasting was because of the crazy thing that I encountered. Never felt like I could talk about it, so that's kind of why I wanted to talk to people that had weird experiences like I did. But I had all the equipment for recording purposes for doing band stuff. So I was like, I have all this stuff sitting here collecting dust, so I may as well use it for something. That's how I kind of kicked off the idea of just doing a podcast, as I haven't been doing music stuff for like 3 years.
I mean, I kind of have a background in music a little bit. I played bass for a while and stuff, but I used to do radio production back when I was in like high school and I used to do film and all that stuff. So it kind of came full circle. And weirdly enough, like when I first started my show, like I had my strange encounters. I talked about like the shadow people and like the sleep paralysis and all that kind of stuff I experienced when I first started the show. But like my main bizarre encounter, I didn't even really talk about for like the first year of me doing the show because it was just one of those things that just sounded so off and weird. It didn't make any sense to me. So I really had to like dig into it myself. Because everything that I kept looking up, people kept telling me like, no, you're wrong. That's what this is. And that's part of the reason why I got so heavy into like, I mean, I come from a background of Native American lineage, I guess you could say. My grandma was 100% Cherokee, so my dad's 50, I'm 25, but I still collected all the stories from her when I was a kid and everything. So it's like I come at a lot of stuff from like the Native American folklore aspect. But my like weird bizarre encounter, I kept finding stuff that fit the bill, but the image wasn't right. And again, that's part of why I dug into a lot of the research that I dug into. And not to be like self-proclaim a title, but I feel like I'm probably one of the people. I'm not going to say I'm the number one, but one of the main people I feel have really dug into the whole like Wendigo folklore and like what it truly really is. Because I've done so much research on it, now I can explain this thing and people can't say, "Oh, that's not a Wendigo," because it fits perfectly the bill if you really dig into Native American folklore. Because I talk about this on a bunch of shows that the image that people have of a Wendigo isn't a Wendigo at all. Like that's not how the natives described it. It was white settlers coming through and trying to make Native American lore seem more savage and primal than it was. So they completely like misconstrued the image of what a Wendigo is in the first place. So it's like I think I was talking to you a little bit about this before the show, but everybody talks about like pill crawlers, for example, and they think it's like a whole new cryptid creature, but nobody's ever seen a Wendigo. And my firm belief is that the pale crawlers are Wendigos. That's just the actual Wendigo, where everybody's expecting to see this deer-headed creature, and that's not what a Wendigo is in the first place. That's not something that exists in this realm that we know of. And if it does, it's a totally different creature because it kind of digs back more into like the whole uh, forest elemental type of spirit aspect more than I feel it actually fits like the Wendigo category.
Mm-hmm. I think when you mentioned the crawlers and like the rake and everything else, I've been looking lately into, I've been wanting to do like an actual deeper interview with someone, kind of dive into some stuff about this, but small humanoid cryptids have really piqued my interest lately. And I think a lot of people are seeing like you got these Dover demons. I interviewed someone who saw something in Florida. It was like a little, like a man. He's like a small, like person type thing. And then I've got someone that said they saw something look like a golem, like from Lord of the Rings. To me, this all sounds like similar type of creatures. If you look at like the description of the Dover demon, the Hopkinsville Goblins, obviously they have ears, but even like some depictions I've seen of people saying rakes, like the smaller ones, the little smaller crawlers or whatever, they're all similar in appearance. I wonder if they're all not seeing the same thing.
I mean, I've kind of dug. I'm currently in the middle of digging into some big things with like the whole like cave dweller aspect, specifically like the
Mm-hmm.
Hopkinsville Goblins. That me in particular, I don't think that the UFO that was seen before the Hopkinsville Goblins is actually related to the Hopkinsville Goblins. And I mean, I can get into a longer, bigger explanation of it, but for anybody that's familiar with the Moon-Eyed People lore of Native American culture, I'm a firm believer that they got pushed underground. If you dig into the lore, it fits it pretty well. And they were called the Moon-Eyed People because they basically could only see at night. They were like nocturnal-eyed beings, and they wouldn't be able to see during the day because it was too bright, too much light to take in. Like there's even stories saying that they actually ambushed this group of people um when the moon was full, because they said even when the moon was full, it was too bright for these things. And the natives never talked about the Moon-Eyed People like they were like a creature or lore. They talked about them like they were like another group of beings or people. And I think that through generations, like if you start digging into stuff with like island species, that either one of two things is going to happen with island species. Either one, they're going to completely adjust and fit the adaptation niche of the island and what it needs to be through them breeding with each other, or the other aspect of it is that they're all going to die off because of inbreeding. So it's like one or the other. But if you put a bunch of these like human like creatures underground and there's generations of these things breeding, I mean, I definitely think that some of the adaptations might end up coming out where other ones don't end up coming out. And I definitely think that there's different variations of cave dwellers. Like if you dig into like the Boogie Men, they were more like primal type people. But then you dig into stuff like the Hopkinsville Goblins, and they almost seem like they were like a more intelligent race. So I definitely think that there's multiple races of things living below the surface, And even digging into like moon-eyed people lore, there was like the short moon-eyed people, and then there were supposedly these like tall moon-eyed people that look just like the little ones, but a taller variation that came from the west, and they got pushed to the east. And then the other one started off in northern Kentucky or southern Kentucky, northern Tennessee, and they got pushed into, I think that they all got pushed into the Mammoth Caves, to be honest with you. But I think that there's two different variations of things that are underground in that area from being pushed into it. And I think that the moon-eyed people are the ones that you'd see like the Hopkinsville Goblins that are like the more intelligent ones, where the Western moon-eyed people that got pushed this way are more of like the tall, lanky, weird beings that are underground. And they may have like through inbreeding, like they kind of took the shittier route, where the moon-eyed people took like the better route, where they actually fit the adaptation better and are actually able to live underground. But that's just two aspects of it. And then going into like the whole UFO thing, I got to finish my research on it, but basically what I'm kind of starting to put together, and it seems to fit through multiple areas, is when you have areas that have high well, it's had volcanic activity in that area, and in turn it's created like magnetic volcanic rock. It seems to be like in, like tunnel shapes. I think that there's a combination of when you take this magnetic rock that's in a circular shape, and then you add pitch, frequency, possibly even speed to it, how it could theoretically possibly create portals. And I mean, like I said, this phenomenon, I dig into it more, it started off as like Kentucky research, but I've been able to fit it to the Lake Michigan Triangle too, because there's volcanic activity that happened in the UP, and all the rock and magma ended up coming down. And it's been in multiple locations, but I think that could theoretically be where like the UFO concept came from. And that's why I say that, like, for the Hopkinsville Goblins, I don't think the UFO is necessarily related to the Hopkinsville Goblins. I think that it was UFOs that were possibly using these like cave portals. And in turn, there's still these people that are living down there. So they're like, oh no, something flew over us, and they end up coming out. But yeah, I don't think that they may have happened around the same time. I think it was just one of those like perfect scenarios where they fell at the same time. So people associate the two, but I definitely think that it's two different phenomenons. I think that's moon-eyed people and UFO portals. As crazy as that sounds to anybody that isn't digging, this kind of weird shit, but that's just kind of where my research has been lately. I'm kind of all over the place with it. And the more I dig into one thing, the more it leads into like 5 other paths, and I have to divide it into specific groups and shows to explain in bite-sized portions instead of just unloading all of that at once. Cause I was like 10% of like how deep all my weird research has gone, but
That's the rabbit holes that, for anyone out there listening, if you start researching into things, it just takes you further and further and further down into different territories of rabbit holes between it. It branches off and just keeps going. Like I said, I haven't been too in depth with looking into things just because I don't ever feel like I have the time trying to manage life and do this. Because for what anyone out there thinks, I don't make any sorts of money. I actually pay money to do this because I have to pay for hosting service and I have to pay for Zoom. So I don't have advertisements. I've been getting compliments from people that, oh, we get to listen to your stuff. There's no ads or anything like that. I was like, that's because I don't have it set up to be monetized, because I think that puts up too much restrictions when you're trying to monetize certain things. And I don't want it to be about that. So it's like, I'm just doing this because I enjoy it. So it's kind of like my hobby. Like, I spent money to be in a band. That's the other myth that I talk to people about on our other show, is like, oh, you're in a band. I was like, that's just a money pit.
I mean, honestly, same with podcasts. Like, I've monetized my stuff, but not monetizing it in like the aspect of having to take away from the show. Like, I use Red Circle for monetizing. So anybody that wants to pull the ads is more than welcome to pull the ads, because I'm never going to change the show. But realistically, it's like most of us podcasters, we're not making crazy money from that shit. Like, realistically, all my monetizing that I have for my episodes pretty much just covers the programs to pay for, but there's still like me paying for the boards, like all the extra stuff. So it's like, it's just trying to maintain the hobby a little bit. So for all those listeners that are out there that hear the ads on stuff, I mean, there are some people that overkill it with ads, but more often than not, if you hear ads, hopefully you don't get too annoyed with us podcasters, because realistically, we're just trying to help pay for the programs. And monetizing, we don't make a lot of money. We make realistically enough to pay for like one program a month through monetizing. So
I
even
think
if you
it's
guys
like,
skip through the ads, they're still there. We still get paid for it. So like, skip through those ads. I do not give 2 fucks if you guys skip through the ads, but they have to be there just to help a little bit paying for the programs.
I think you only get like a fraction of a cent for each person that listens to an ad, don't you? I don't know like the actual
It's like ten
number.
dollars for every 1,000, roughly. That's roughly like the area of what it is.
No.
Like $10 for every 1,000. So it's like $1 for every 100.
Yeah.
So a penny per listen, realistically.
So I'm not a big time podcaster, so I don't have thousands upon thousands of followers. So it's not like I would make any money off of it anyways. I basically spend about $45 a month just to run a podcast.
Oh, I probably spend more. I guarantee you I spend more than I take in as far as the podcast goes. But again, it's a passion, like you said. So it's like, it's not about that. I'm going to do the show regardless. It's just that the little bit of monetizing just, takes away just a little tiny bit of the programs you got to pay for to make it a little bit easier to do all this kind of stuff. But
Mm-hmm. I guess if I could pick and choose the advertisements, if someone offered me something like, hey, we want you to talk about our product and something that I actually was okay about, I wouldn't mind it. But at the same time, like I see it as the person listening to is like, I don't want to hear about certain things because it's like this has zero interest to me at all. So like why is it being specifically advertised to me? But that's
I mean,
neither here
half
nor
my
there.
ads are in Spanish, as weird as that is. I don't know why, but everybody messages me and says that my ads are in a different language. But the only ad that I actively do, and it's not even really an ad, it's it's a friend, Joe from Crypto Theology. I usually give him like a shout out and talk about what he does on each episode, but I don't make any money off of that. It's literally just he helps me out, I help him out. I really enjoy the stuff that he does. So it's like stuff like that I love doing. Like
I've
I'll do that
never
all
even heard
day,
ads
any
on
day.
yours.
Yeah, so, I mean, certain people don't even get them in the first place. Like the only ad that I actively put on there that I want people to listen to is when I do my intro. I just talk about crypto theology for a minute, but that's just because Joe is one of the best people I've ever met in this community. He does a lot for the community. He just put out just at Squonkapalooza in Pennsylvania. So it's like he does a lot. So it's like I want to give back to him as much as I can. He hooks me up on shirts and stuff like that once in a while, but I don't make any money off him. He doesn't make any money off of me. It's just like a mutual trying to help each other out because we both enjoy what each other kind of do, kind of a thing. And that's I'm always cool for that kind of stuff. I'd love to have more people like that want to just collab and help each other out and do ads in that aspect. But it's like again, it's I don't care about the money. I'm just doing it because I really enjoy Joe's designs that he makes for crypto theology because they're all cryptid related, like merchandise and stuff, which is cool as hell. And I've never seen anybody do designs quite like him. He has his own original like flair to it because he's a comic book. He was a comic book artist, so it's like he brings that into it. And I'm an ex comic book, not an ex comic book guy, but I used to be a really big comic book guy. So it's just like I don't know, just a mutual thing. We both like what each other do, kind of a thing. But yeah, I try not to overkill it with ads. I don't like doing ads. My whole intention when I started the show was to do that like value for value concept, but a lot of people listen to shows, but they don't necessarily like support the shows. And I don't mean that in like a, oh, give me your money kind of way. I mean, like just in general of like people just commenting on stuff, being interactive with the podcast in general, just even shooting messages saying like, hey man, I really enjoyed the podcast. It's like, if I had stuff like that all day, like I could care less about getting ads, but it's like everybody listens to the show, but not very many people interact or support it. So it's like at a certain point, sometimes you kind of get to a point where it's like you partly have to monetize at least a little bit, just to help it so that it kind of pulls people over. But that being said, for all those people that hate ads on podcasts, man, interact on those podcasts, even shooting messages saying you enjoy their podcast. And I guarantee you'll probably start seeing less ads because that's realistically what all those podcasters want is just people interacting with what we're doing in our shows.
Yeah. I hardly get a whole lot of interaction. I've only had a few people actually reach out to me to come on the show. I've had to post stuff up usually on Facebook groups looking for people because a lot of the time no one ever contacts me. Like I always talk about you want to be on the show, there's where you send me an email and you message me on Facebook, whatever. And then it gets disappointing sometimes because you don't ever hear from anybody. I was like, well, does anyone even listen to the show? Then I go and look at my stats. I was like, yeah, people are listening. Apparently they like to listen, but they just don't have anything to talk about. So then I have to hunt and hunt and hunt for guests. And then half the time they ghost me. So it's a never ending cycle.
Dude, it never stops. That's just how it is a lot of the time. I mean, one of the biggest things I've ever done for the show that helped out like crazy is just having an Instagram. I get more interaction through Instagram than anywhere else. And as far as like podcasts go, I feel like Instagram is probably like the best place to get interaction as far as your podcast goes. And I wasn't a big fan of like TikTok and shit, but ever since I started TikTok, there's a lot more interaction too. It's like you have to give them like a means. Like when you just have the audio aspect and you tell people to like, hey, shoot, do this, do that. People are no insult to anybody out there, but people don't want to sit there and like type out the email and like do all that extra work. But if you just make it so they click two links and can get there, you'll have surprisingly way more interactions. You just got to make it convenient and easy for people.
Yeah. I I am very much I hate social media. It's like so the thought of having to have a TikTok, like I have an Instagram, I don't post on it. I have a Twitter, I don't think I've posted on it. Like I have all this stuff and I just don't ever do anything with it. Like I wouldn't even have a Facebook if I didn't do like basically Facebook is now like my photo keeper for just family stuff. I don't even really piss around with it either.
It's a
I don't
double edged sword, man. It's like, you want to do a podcast and just talk. And coming from somebody that also isn't a big fan of social media, it's like doing a podcast, you quickly have to kind of do that stuff. Cause I mean, before I started my podcast, I was one of those people that it was like I go all day and not get one notification on my phone. But ever since I started the podcast, it's like nonstop, just this fucking feed of notifications. And it's like I enjoy, people responding and stuff, but sometimes it's just like overwhelming going from that guy that never had notifications on his phone to every single time I try to knock down notifications, it refills back up. So my phone is always just full of stuff. And it's not even always like people messaging me. It's more so just like likes and comments and everything on like Instagram and stuff like that. But yeah, it's kind of like I said, double-edged sword. It's like you just want to do a podcast and just be able to talk on a podcast. But the other half of doing a podcast is that you unfortunately have to be ridiculously active on social media. Because it took me like 2 years to get a TikTok. Like I never wanted to have TikTok. I don't go on TikTok like that. Like I don't scroll through shit. I strictly just post stuff on TikTok. And just doing that, it's like brought the feed up like crazy. And it's like I don't even like actively use it like that. I just literally just post stuff on there, just kind of leave it as what it is, just because I know a lot of people are on there.
hmm I probably will have to do that here at some point, but I'm just been old man holding a grudge against it, I guess. I'm almost 40, so I've got my heels dug in my old ways, I guess.
Well, I'll have to talk to you about it after the show. I use a program specifically that helps make clips for me. So it's like, oh, clips already made, upload on TikTok. Tries to keep it as minimal and as easy as possible. But I'll talk to you a little bit about that after the
Okay.
show.
Yeah. Whatever makes it easier for me would be a lot more enticing, I think, just because again, I literally work over 40 hours a week and then everything else, it's just like it never ends.
So you and I are in the same boat. So yeah, I've definitely found the tricks to making it so that you can be active on social media with minimal effort.
Well, if you would like to talk about that experience you had that kind of got you into looking into things, we can do that real quick.
Oh, for sure. So this is kind of it extends just beyond like the Wendigo thing. So I kind of feel like if I'm going to tell this story, I kind of have to talk about Northville Psychiatric Hospital as a whole, because there's a few different experiences that all kind of happened there and led up to the main moment that happened. But originally, before I really got into starting a podcast, doing any of this kind of stuff, my girlfriend and I got into urban exploring. And for anybody that's not familiar with what urban exploring is, it's essentially where you basically go through like abandoned buildings. And I mean, we never like were destructive by any means of abandoned buildings because we found just like beauty in like the destruction, weirdly enough. So we would try to find all of these abandoned places and just basically go and explore them, respectful, of course, to it. Like we were never those people that were like smashing windows out, doing nothing like that. We just wanted to see the places. We thought they were really interesting and cool. Try to like preserve them for the next people that goes through. So, not like destroying shit. But we were regularly going to this place almost like every single weekend. And Northville Psychiatric Hospital, for anybody that's not familiar, there's a lot of weirdness behind it. It's in Northville, Michigan. There's stories that I heard about just them ridiculously like mistreating their patients, just a lot of stuff that was involved in that place. But it was definitely, you heard all these stories about the place being haunted, like specific buildings, weird things happening. But we go there almost every weekend. We had the place mapped out to the point where it's not just the main hospital. There's all these different satellite buildings around it. There's dorms, there's like gyms, there's all this other weird stuff. But so we got to the point where it was like pretty much like we had it completely mapped out. We knew every single spot, where to go, where to get away from, like if the cops are going to show up, all that kind of stuff. We would go through like the theater area and like the church and everything where everybody said all this like haunted activity was from. And, we catch like orbs, but I mean, with abandoned buildings like that, it's kind of like a hard thing between it. Like, is it an orb or just some dust? But either way, I mean, it's all still interesting all the same. But at least from all the videos that I saw, I just kind of more so got the assumption of like it's just dust in the air. So nothing like super crazy really happened here at this point. So before I started really digging into like the paranormal like that, like I was always interested in it, but I didn't know like the rules, so to speak. So I ended up finding a no smoking sign there and this weird little like tiki thing that was like carved out of foam and it looked like it was like hand painted. So I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. So I ended up bringing both of those home. And when we got home, it was me and my girlfriend at the time. We went upstairs, dropped the stuff off, the backpacks, all that stuff. Came downstairs. And the way that her front room is set up, it's one of those, well, her old house. It's set up where it's like the front room, and then the kitchen's the opposite wall behind it, but it has the two doorways, so it's like a loop. And then there's the stairs that comes down in the side into the front room. So we both come down the stairs. I'm standing at the bottom of the stairs, and she goes to walk into the kitchen, and she doesn't go through like the door that's close to the stairs. She goes to the far door. But in the process of her going to walk through the front room, we end up seeing this dark figure sitting on the couch. And for anybody that's familiar with shadow people, perfectly fits that description where it was pitch black in the house, but this thing was darker than dark and it was in the shape of a human. And my girlfriend walks past it and she did one of those things where it's like you're freaked out about something. So you just continue past it rather than like stop and like look at it. So she like, I'm staring at it. She's staring at it. She walks right past it, right in front of it, loops around, comes out the other side of the kitchen and goes, "You saw that, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I saw that." And we both looked over and it wasn't there anymore. So I was like, all right, that was weird. So then I started digging into stuff and I was like, all right, you're not supposed to take things from paranormal locations because things can attach themselves to it. And specifically, what I think this thing may have been attached to was that tiki head that I found because, for anybody that's not familiar with like how like a psychiatric hospital, for example, would do like arts and crafts, they're not going to give you like wood to sit there and carve and scrape out. They're going to give you something that you're not going to hurt yourself with. So they're going to give you things like foam and like a butter knife or whatever, just to like do crafts and not do anything that you can really like hurt yourself with. So I firmly believe that this tiki head thing that I grabbed was more than likely something that was probably made by one of the patients that was there. So I quickly got rid of that out of the house. We went back. I ended up bringing it back like to the building itself, and we never ended up seeing another thing in that house from those items. Like, I mean, there was other weirdness going on in that house, but it wasn't from that item. So fast forward a little bit, and the next kind of weird thing that happened there was we were up on the seventh floor, and there's all the windows were completely there on this floor. Like there wasn't any smashed out windows, there wasn't any like drafts or anything like that. And we're walking through that floor, and by the elevator, there was this blue door with a smiley face painted on it, and it just slammed shut in front of us, like hard slam shut. And I was like, "Whoa!" Like it scared the hell out of me at the time. And so just to like test it out, like I left the door open. We hung out around there just to see if it would slam shut again, and it never slammed shut again. And I couldn't find any drafts, nothing that they could have came from. So that was a little bit weird. So I don't know if it was that same day or another day that was another weekend past it, but we're up on, I think, the third floor of the building. And I'm looking out the back window, and back behind it, there's like this wooded area. And I saw this thing come out of the wooded area. And from like what I could see, and my girlfriend's friend who was with me at the time, she saw it, it looked like a cougar. And for anybody that's not familiar with Michigan, like we don't have cougars there, especially not in Northville, which is pretty close to Detroit. So it was kind of weird. And the weirder part about it was this thing looked up at us on the window on the third floor. It wasn't like we were making noise or doing anything, but it was like looking directly at us. And it's not too often I feel that you see like big cats really like looking up for something unless there's something that like alerts them to look up. So that was just weird that it seemed to be like looking right at us. And then it backs up and links back into the woods. And I'm like, all right, I don't know which way to leave now. We should probably hang out in here for a while because that thing was like right on the path of like where we go to leave out of this place. And I ended up looking it up, and apparently there was random cougar sightings in this area in Northville. And anybody wants to look it up, you can look it up. But a body was never found. They never found the cougar. They just knew that there was cougar sightings in this area, which was weird. It was just like this one specific cougar. So I think that the reason I'm telling that is because I think it relates to the other half of the story, which gets into like the Wendigo part. So we were basically had this entire place mapped down to the point where it was like we've seen everything a million times, but the only place that we hadn't really checked out was the basement that leads into the Northville tunnels, as they call them, which is this like tunnel system that goes under the town. It can go for miles. The reason why we didn't end up going in there before was because you don't want to take the risk of walking down there, running out of battery flashlight, and then feeling your way back in a mile of the dark underground. That sounds awful and scary, not in like a good way. So we never really fucked with going to the basement, but we got to a point where we got so versed in this place that we just wanted some other new exciting thing to go and check out. So I knew that from the hospital itself, there was entrances into those tunnels from the basement. So we ended up going down into the basement, and I stepped down to the basement, and there's this wall to the right that had a big hole knocked out of it, but not like knocked out of it like somebody hit it with something, but rather somebody like removed it brick by brick. And assumably it was probably something that was there from when the hospital was active, but it wasn't like they're trying to create a doorway, but it wasn't like a perfect doorway that they were like trying to form a new doorway. It was like one of the ones where like the bricks don't lay right, so it's kind of the scattered doorway opening. So I walked down the corner or walked down the stairs. That's to my right. I turned to go into that room because I'm just going to peek at every single corner I can in the basement because that's just how we always ended up exploring this place. And I walk into that room. There's this metal girty cart thing on the back wall of it. So the second I step into this room, I hear this voice in my right ear and it says, run. And when I hear that, I look forward and behind this metal girty cart thing, this tall, lanky creature stands up. The best way to describe its skin was like gray, like rotting, like decrepit, whitish, pale, creepy skin. And it had long black hair and it was like greasy on the top of its head. It wasn't like fully covered in hair. It was just on the top of its head, slicked back and like greasy and gross looking. And this thing stood up with this pose where it had like its arms up and it was taller than like what a person would be, and it was lankier than a person would be. Like it wasn't the fit or like the structure of a person. And this happened all within like a split second. And I took off upstairs and out. The girls were following me, which was my girlfriend and her friend at the time. I didn't explain to them like what was happening. I just told them like run, 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 run. Let's get the hell out of here. So we knew that place, like I said, mapped down perfectly. We knew which doors were like welded shut. So I took the direct path out to get the fuck out of that building and out the back. And as we're running out, my girlfriend's taking pictures behind us, and I'll actually send it to you after the show. I firmly believe that she actually partly caught like a apparition picture of this thing. And I didn't know how to explain that or how to categorize it for such a long time. Like I didn't know what it was. Everything that I kept looking for kept coming back to like pale crawler, but it didn't fit the like demeanor, I guess you could say, of this thing. What I kept coming back to was Wendigo, but you think of like the modern picture of like what a Wendigo is, like the deer antlers and the skull head and all that. So I kept like deterring away from it, even though now I'm a firm believer that that's what it was. So it took until after I was running my podcast for a while, I had on Justin from Cryptids of the Corn, and we started connecting dots, and we connected the dot with the weird cougar sighting, the fact that this thing was underground, which for anybody that's not familiar with like Wendigo lore, the whole idea is that you're not safe from the first snowfall to the last snowfall because they're rotting flesh. They can only be out when it's cold in order to preserve their flesh. So there's all these legends of these things hiding in caves, underground, burying themselves underground, basically trying to stay in places that are cool, which the Northville tunnels underneath were a good like 20-degree drop from above the surface. So it totally makes sense why this thing was down there. And then we also connected the fact that with the whole Wendigo, it's not like somebody chooses to be that. So there's still the human spirit within that that's fighting this other spirit that's like taking them over. And there's all these like native stories about basically people figuring out like a Wendigo's name and it will like freeze them in their tracks because they'll have this like internal battle between like the human and this like Wendigo spirit within them. So we kind of came to the conclusion and believe that possibly because I do have Native American lineage, that this thing actually had the opportunity to basically tell me to run. And that was the spirit that was within that. That was the human telling me to basically get the hell out of there. So then again, I started digging more into into the lore, into the research, realized that the actual like image of a Wendigo is actually a tall, lanky, decrepit, zombie looking like creature that has a nonstop hunger. So it ends up eating its lips, and it's just this weird, creepy, like lanky creature. And the whole reason why people think that it has like this whole image of like the skull and like the deer head and everything was actually from like white settlers that were traveling across the country and like collecting like native stories. And just like a lot of the native stuff that you see, they'll take like sacred Native American locations and call it like the devil's this, the devil's that. So they try to like demonize the Native American culture and make it more demonic, pagan, whatever than it has to be. So they added the whole image of the deer head and the skull and all that kind of stuff, I feel, to try to make it so it was to kind of fit the more like demonic category, so that most people would hear like the Native American lore and associate it with like demonic things. And it's just not as popular of an image, of course. So to have like a zombie like creature. So, thanks to Hollywood, people telling stories from later on, they kind of just completely misconstrued and kind of like ruined the image of like what an Wendigo actually is. So everybody has this image of a Wendigo, but I don't actually believe that's the Wendigo. But then after that, the up spike of like pale crawlers, like we were talking about, started popping up. So I'm a firm believer that the pale crawler is actually the Wendigo, and what people think that the Wendigo isn't even a thing. It's just something that people have created. And because of this weird experience happening, me not really talking about it for a while, because again, I didn't know what category to put it into. And people were just like, oh, that's not what it is. That's this. Oh, that's this. Oh, that's that. So I had to do my own digging, my own research into it. And now I'm at the point where it's like, unless somebody throws me some more solid evidence with lore and whatever to back it up, like I'm in the firm category believing that this was a Wendigo encounter, and that basically what people believe is a Wendigo is all just misconstrued due to like changing of the culture and whitewashing everything as it came through and making everything that was Native American demonic, bad, whatever. But yeah, it's been a journey, and I've done probably more research now on Wendigo and Wendigo lore than anything else. But it all kind of stems back to that one strange encounter. And just to throw in another kind of weird portion about it too, just like the whole like skinwalker thing, like natives don't like referring to Wendigos, because it's one of those things that if you call it, you say it, like you're calling its name, you're beckoning it. So you're just pretty much asking for it at this point. And at one point, I tried to have this artist named Timothy Williams do like a depiction of this Wendigo spirit that I saw, this creature that I saw. And he was in the process of trying to do it. And he said that night he had a bunch of nightmares about Wendigos, and specifically like the one that he was painting. So him and I both kind of came to the conclusion that by creating this image, it's almost like entrapping that spirit, that being, into a picture. So both of us pretty much decided, based on the lore, is probably a good idea just to leave it alone. And that's kind of where I fall in with like the new modern image of what a Wendigo is. It's probably a good thing that people don't really know what a Wendigo looks like, because if you're accompanying that into a picture, it's almost like capturing that spirit in the picture. But when people are drawing their depictions of a Wendigo, it's not a Wendigo. So it's like, no worries. So it's like, for the common good of the average person, I almost feel like it's like a good thing that people don't really know what a Wendigo really looks like. But kind of extensive, but that's probably as many pieces of the story as I could put together at the moment. But unfortunately, that place has been torn down due to random deaths that have happened there. There's people that supposedly fell down the elevator shaft, which, coming from somebody who used to spend a lot of time in there, those elevator doors were closed maybe to like an inch or two. So I definitely think there was foul play involved. And I don't know how conspiratorial everybody out there gets, but I definitely believe that when there's weird phenomenon happening in specific places, that the local government is fully aware of it. And by local government, I mean like the city itself. So when the weird stuff like this happens, rather than like addressing it, they'll just tear down the building and pretend like they're doing some other thing. But I think that they knew what was going on here. They knew that there was some kind of weird phenomenon happening here, even if they didn't necessarily know it was like a Wendigo, for example. So they tore the building down and left it as it is. So unfortunately, I never got to really go back and see if I ever saw this creature again. But just kind of weird that they ended up tearing that place down after all just like weird happening, and me seeing that weird thing in the basement, and
How,
then them never finding that cougar that supposedly was in the area.
how long ago was this?
Let's see, probably I think my daughter was like 1 or 2 at the time, so like at least like 6 or 7 years ago.
And then they tore it down just recently or a couple of years
Or
after that?
around that same time, about 6 or 7 years ago. It was when my daughter was little. Because they
Okay.
turned it into like a park. They still have some of the satellite buildings, but the main hospital where this encounter was, they tore that. That was like the first thing they tore down. And as far as like all the other random side buildings go, they were like dorms and they didn't have anything leading to the tunnels. So they like have some of them up, but I never experienced anything weird in those buildings. It seems like the ones that they tore down specifically are the ones that had weird phenomenon happening, which again is why I kind of question like, why did you really tear it down in the first place? Was it because it was an eyesore, or is it because you knew something weird was happening here and you were trying to, I guess, theoretically like save people from going here and getting hurt, killed by whatever this weird creature was that was existing in this area at the time?
I think negative energies manifest themselves in areas of high places, I guess, of negative energies. Like if it was an insane asylum, I can't imagine it had a lot of positive vibes going on in there.
There's a lot of horror stories about like patients escaping and them literally like chasing them down, tying them up, and dragging them back. And at least when I was exploring around there, there was a pretty good handful of these rooms when you went down this weird hallway where they were like those observing rooms, where it was like the two-way glass and then like a chair in the middle of like a tile room. But on the other side where the glass was, there was like this board of a bunch of controls. And who knows what those controls were? They could have been something as simple as microphones, but the board is pretty extensive, or it could have been something all the way to like shock therapy, for example. But there was definitely a lot of trauma and awful things that happened here. And I had talked to a few people that were locals at the time when this place was active, and they told me horror stories about they'd hear people screaming and crying out in the night from this place almost every single night. So there was a lot of trauma and residual terrible energy in this area.
Yeah, I don't live too far. I actually used to work not for it, but like part of the place where I work was on the state insane asylum. It's only about 15 miles from here. It's a state hospital, but it's still open, and they've got a prison out there. And they used to have, I know they had murderers at one point, like people that were deemed criminally insane were out there. Obviously, they're kept almost like in the prison part of it. But I've been out in some of those buildings and stuff like that just because I had to work out there. There's just a creep vibe to it. I don't know how else to say it. Like you just pick up weird vibes here and there.
I mean, I don't know if you get super duper into like the whole like paranormal residual haunting aspect, but like, there's definitely like active hauntings, which are like the ones that like interact with people. And then there's this whole concept about residual hauntings, which is pretty much like something so traumatic happens in an area that it like repeats through time. And that's usually those like paranormal encounters you see where like the ghosts don't even acknowledge that there's people there. It's almost like they're playing on like a loop. And I kind of believe that like rather than that actually being like a conscious, like active spirit or ghost, it's rather that there was something so bad that happened there that it's just like almost like a like leaves like an imprint in time that just repeats forever and ever and ever in that area. And I definitely think that a lot of these types of places are definitely fitting that category. But on the other side of things too, it's like you have such a high point of emotion there that I've often wondered if it goes both ways, that it may not just always be something traumatic, but maybe if something so great happens in an area, you'll still get that residual haunting aspect. And the closest I've kind of found to this that may be a possibility is like the old saloons where you'll hear like haunted music playing from like the background and stuff. And I mean, maybe that's from so many people had such a good time at that bar that it just echoes through time forever. Because a lot of those like bar hauntings where you hear like the ominous music playing in the background, like there's not, I mean, of course there are some cases where there's like crazy things that'll happen, like, people getting thrown around, people getting scratched, like whatever. But there's a lot of them too, where that people just hear that music, but they don't hear anything else and they don't see anything else. And yeah, I kind of wonder if those ones are ones that, again, it was something so good and so fun happened there that it just echoes through time forever. And it's not a conscious haunting. It's just like an imprint of something that happened through time.
Yeah, I've never really thought about it like that. That makes sense
Because then, I
because
mean, with the hospitals, with like the baby areas too, you always hear about like, oh, that area is haunted. I mean, there could be the fact that there was mothers that passed away during birth, or the other aspect could be that it was such a magical moment that it just imprinted and echoes through time at that point.
Yeah. Again, that's something I never really thought about. Gives me something to think about here after a while.
I go deep,
Um,
man. This is where my brain goes all day. This is part of the reason why I started a podcast, is because it's like all day I just will get caught on like a thought train, and I'll just continue like rolling on it. And that again was part of like what I was saying with like the difference between like my show and a lot of other shows, is that a lot of people have somebody on and just do like a straight interview, but I like to get really deep into thought with the guest. And that's part of, I feel, the fun of like podcasting, is being able to like share those deep thoughts with people that I normally would just kind of keep in my own head. Kind of made me go from like the quiet guy, I didn't talk to anybody, to now it's like I can talk to anybody, just off of having like a means of being able to like express these deep weird thoughts that I have in my head regularly.
yeah, that's kind of how I am too. Like, I'm not a very outgoing person to an extent. Like, I'll talk to people if I have to, but I prefer to not talk. That's kind of why I like the way I have my podcast set up, is I let everyone else talk and I just listen. That's how I've always been in my normal interactions with people too, is I usually just, I'm the observer, the listener, or whatever. So I don't really engage a whole lot of conversations out of people if I don't have to. A lot of people think I'm an asshole, but I was like, I'm not necessarily an asshole. It's just I'm not very outgoing, I guess.
I mean, honestly, man, I'm the same way. It's like if I'm around my people, you probably won't get me to shut up like on the shows, like people that are on the same wavelength as me. But for all the listeners out there, like me in my regular life, like going about every day, like I'm the dude that goes to the grocery store and doesn't want to say a word to nobody. But again, it's like as soon as you put me at like a cryptid convention or paranormal convention, like I'm active, I'm talking to everybody, I'm like collecting the stories and stuff. It's just time and place, you know, you got to find your group of people. And once you find your group of people, then you don't feel like that. But being the observing one is never necessarily the bad thing, though, because that's part of the reason why I got so far into like psychology, is because it's like I spend 90% of my life just observing people like at work and doing this and doing that. So it's like after observing for a while, I'm sure you kind of pick up on it too. There's certain things you can kind of like do to like, I don't want to say trick people, but like kind of, I don't know, it's psychology tricks. That's the best way to describe it. Like, you know, you'll start noticing things like something as simple as if you stare somebody in the eyes, they know you're talking to them directly. But if you stare at somebody's forehead in between their eyebrows, they're going to get really uncomfortable, but they're not going to know why, because they're going to assume that you're looking at them in the eyes. So it's just weird observational shit that you start like picking up like that on that kind of stuff with people. And one of the best parts about sitting back and being the observant one is that more often than not, people can't lie to you, because you start picking up on everybody's cues on when they're lying, when they're nervous, when they're doing this, when they're doing that. So it's like time and place. You know, you have to be a little bit on both sides. You have to be the observant one, but in the right group of people, you have to be the active talking one. Um, Depending on kind of what the necessity is at the time, I guess.
When it comes into dealing with the territories that we do here in this podcast, you have to pick up on when people are lying, because I'm pretty sure I've interviewed a few people who've told me some bullshit stories, but I'm not here to prove or disprove anyone. I mean, what they tell me, that's someone comes on here and wants to lie to me. I guess that's their waste of time. I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm not going to tell someone they're lying just because my own experiences, I think, sound crazy too. So who am I to say someone else is wrong?
That's kind of where I'm at with it too, man. It's like you pick up on certain things, and after you do a podcast for so long, it's kind of like you pick up on cues, and you know when somebody's bullshitting you, when people are being genuine and serious. Um, but in the process too, it's kind of like there's the other side with like the trauma aspect too, that it's like, you know, for example, somebody is a UFO abductee and they're trying to explain this UFO incident, you know, that they got probed, so to speak, or this or that. But depending on what the age that it happened, a lot of the time people will try to cover up a traumatic experience that they can't explain with something even more unexplainable. Like, I've talked to a bunch of people that, not necessarily on my show, but just like people in like the world that have told me about their like alien abduction experiences. That when you start kind of putting time and place together, you realize that, as messed up as this sounds, people that have gotten like molested, for example, will cover that up with a UFO abduction, especially if it happens at a young age. So rather than like rationalizing in their head that, for example, like their uncle, you know, was knocking at the back door, so to speak, they rationalize it with they got probed by a UFO because it was so traumatic that they cover it up. So it's like some of these people, their story may not be truthful, but to them, it is the truth because they mentally covered it up with this other scenario because they themselves couldn't rationalize the fact that their uncle, like I said, for example, was like touching them. So they cover it up with these extraterrestrials were coming and touching them. So it's like, you know, whether or not somebody's telling their story completely how it is or not, a lot of the time I feel like in somebody's head, that story is 100% true and accurate. It's just you kind of have to see the pieces and connect stuff to realize that, you know, they may have covered something up in their head and they're speaking their truth, but it may not be like the real world truth, so to speak.
That's what I've said is it don't necessarily have to be, I don't necessarily have to believe it, but I believe they tell me the stories that they believe in. Like it's their truth. So
And that's
that's,
half the battle too, is just giving people a platform to do that. Cause like you, for example, like you didn't have anywhere to put your story, but all it takes is somebody just to sit and listen. And I mean, sometimes it's like people just want somebody to listen to them, you know? It's like, you know, even if you think that the story's bullshit, if you just sit and listen to the person, like it means the world to them. And I mean, like that's the difference that I feel that I'm trying to make half the time. And I'm sure you are too, that it's like, you know, some of these people's stories are really, really out there, but they needed to say it even just to come to terms with themselves, so to speak. So it's like half the time being a podcaster, it's like you're almost trying to be like a listening ear to somebody that normally wouldn't have anywhere to put their encounter story, be it that again it's 100% accurate or it's their depiction of what they think happened based on their brain trying to cover up a traumatic event.
I feel like it's therapeutic for them and therapeutic for myself because it helps me accept what I had happen. And I feel like I'm trying to help them accept what they had happen to them. So it's like a mutual beneficial podcast, I guess.
I mean, that's 100% true because I guarantee you, you know, I was talking about like my astro traveling, my sleep paralysis stuff when I first started, but I definitely wouldn't have told this, my Wendigo encounter story if it wasn't for other people coming on my show and telling me their stories because by them doing that, it makes me not feel insane for telling my story because it's like I've told people that in my real life and it's like nobody wants to hear that shit. Nobody believes in that kind of stuff, but you find the right community and people actually listen. And I'm just stating it for exactly how I saw it. I mean, maybe my image was misconstrued. Maybe I heard a voice in my head. Maybe, you know, it was a crackhead, for example, you know, but like from my perspective, like that's my story. That's my encounter. That's all the weird stuff that happened around it. But I would have never gained the courage to even tell the story in the first place if it wasn't for other people coming on my show and telling their stories and encounters. And I
Yeah.
hate using the term stories because stories sounds like it's false, like it's
hmm
fiction. I try to use the term encounter, but of course I always, you know, everybody slips and stuff like that. But it's like story, I feel kind of puts like a damper on it in the first place, where a lot of people listen to it and assume that it's fiction because of the wording.
Short
And
story. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm very adamant about particular using particular words for particular instances. Like, for example, like I particularly use the word bizarre for bizarre encounters because bizarre is something that's weird and undescribable that brings in some aspect of like fascination to it. So it's like I try to be very like literal with my words and use them to like the proper definitions of them. And it's just like certain things that will fall into a weird category people will not hear it as truthful. Like for example, use the word lore and people want to hear that because it sounds like there's some kind of backing to it. But you use the term folklore and people hear folklore, they instantly assume like a fictional story. So it's like they both mean the same thing, but depending on the wording, they kind of get inferred different ways.
Yeah. That's kind of how I came up with my name, even though after I started the podcast, apparently there's a Australian podcast. It's called Tinfoil Tales that talks about their government, which I've been got. That's the most emails I've gotten from people was talking about the wrong podcast. I get a lot of people from Australia emailing me about my opinion on what the government's doing now or what these people are doing out in the back end of the deserts. I was like, I don't even live in Australia. I have no idea what the hell you're talking about.
That's one of the hardest parts about podcasts is trying to find a name that nobody else has used. Because just a prime example, when I first started my show, I did this other side show called Big Dumb Inquiries with this dude named Kyle Rainey from the Big Dumb Podcast. But there's also another podcast called My Big Dumb Mouth. And then there was the Big Dumb Podcast. And he had the same issue where everybody was like trying to go to one show but it was going to the other one. And yeah, it's just really, really hard to like find that perfect name. Like it took me a while to come up with the Increase of Our Reality. And it was one of those like shower moments where it just like sprung into my head and I was like, that's perfect. Same with Bizarre Encounters. Like all my show names, like Open Minds Media, you abbreviate that and it's OMM, which is Ohm. So it's like Ohm. So it still kind of fits that thing. It's like it's hard to find that perfect name that other people aren't using, but it's like when it hits you, and then you just gotta run with it and make it work. But it's like half the time when I was trying to set up the names for my shows, it's like I'm Google searching the hell out of like every different variation of it to make sure nobody else had anything close to it so that I could take over the Google search as far as that name goes.
Mm-hmm.
And
No,
Anchors of Our Reality is like my nobody has that shit. And Bizarre Encounters is starting to kind of take over. I mean, it was kind of generic, not a generic name, but like other people have used it, like, oh, check out this Bizarre Encounter, but no other show was named Bizarre Encounters, but like that terminology got used. But it took until like a couple months ago that now Bizarre Encounters, the podcast, takes over the name Bizarre Encounters on Google. But up until then, it was like you looked up Bizarre Encounters and you get like, oh, check out this Bizarre Encounter story. So it's like it's hard to find the right wording to make it so that it's like your thing, you know?
yeah. I just Google tinfoil tells, and the first things that pops up are the ones from Australia.
You just got to
Like,
keep pushing and take over the
yeah,
name. That's what it is. Or just
yeah,
add like a slight little variation to it and then you'll pull it all back from there. But, or you just got to hope that maybe one day that show will just stop. I mean, not that I want any podcast to stop. Anybody's doing a podcast, keep rolling with it because that's half the battle is not stopping. Because I've seen a lot of really great podcasts just stop because they just didn't want to deal with it anymore, whatever. Like you just got to keep grinding and keep doing it and keep doing it. But, in certain aspects, it's kind of like drop the name so that I can take it.
yeah. Like I said, when I Googled it and nothing popped up, and then right after I'd started it, I'd started seeing another one. I was like, oh, well, they're from Australia. It's not going to impact mine. And then all of a sudden, started getting these random emails like, well, apparently it did exactly what I thought it wasn't going to do. But oh well, maybe I gained some extra fans out of it.
Hey, it's not necessarily a bad thing though. I mean, when I first started Open Minds Media, like I had it all across the internet. Open Mind Media was mine. And then I go on Instagram and there's some like Puerto Rican media company that was using Open Minds Media as all one word. So just because of that one Instagram that had like 20 followers, I had to start making myself open underscore minds underscore media. Because if I didn't do the underscores, then it was just like one facet of social media with 20 followers was going to make it so I couldn't use the name across everything. So I had to like,
Mm-hmm.
kind of tweak it and bend it. But now I've completely taken over that name. So that place is just, they didn't even have an active post for like 3 years before I started my thing. So I already knew that was like a dead page, but you got to do your feel around because I was like already halfway through making names for everything before I found that one on Instagram. And I was like, shit. And then I had to go back and rechange everything to having like the underscore to it so that I could have a universal name across everything because that's how I try to do everything to make it easy.
Yeah, that's what I tried doing too. As far as I know, everything I have is just tinfoil tells, so I at least got ahead of them on that one.
I
So,
mean, even big shows it happens to. Like I know Strange Brew podcast, one of my buddies, Tom, he had an issue where he said that there was some other place that was starting to try to use Strange Brew, but they were using it from like the like music aspect, and they were naming their show off of like the movie Strange Brew. So like, yeah, it's still you got to tweak stuff, man. That's like half the battle. It's really hard to do and not
hmm
find somebody else that's already used the name or whatever in some way, shape, or form, or even like wording it that way. Because I have even seen that happen where like I started Bite Size Bizarrities, which is like the sub show of Bizarre Encounters, and we do like stuff that wouldn't normally take up like a full episode. It's like 15-20 minute ones. It's been a little bit since we did that, but I purposely used the term like Bite Size Bizarrities, and then after I started using that, I'm not going to throw any names or anything, but I saw a couple other podcasts that were doing like bite size this, and I'm like, damn well that I was using that first, and you guys just jacked it because you guys didn't start using that until I dropped a couple of those episodes. Like, hey, any other wording you could use, like crumb size, like anything, like don't use that one because I'm already using that.
I think podcasting is all about borrowing from each other.
That's
To,
true. You're
to
not
be
wrong on that one.
to be 100% honest, like when I started doing this, I hadn't really listened to a whole lot of podcasts because it was never really something that ever really appealed to me. Like I never really got into podcast or listening or anything like that. I knew like Joe Rogan had a podcast or some shit like that. It wasn't anything that like I ever really dived into. So I wasn't until I wanted to start doing a podcast that I really started listening to podcasts, and I was like, well, shit. What I wanted to do, there's already people doing what I wanted. I thought what I was thinking, I was like, maybe I'm doing something original. I was like, well, clearly found out that I wasn't had any original ideas at all.
I mean, it's one of those things too that it's like there's only I don't want to say there's only so many ideas, but it's like there's bound to be overlapping. Like podcast is no different than music. Like there's artists that are within the same genre, so it's
Yeah.
like they're not the same, but they kind of have the same sound. So it's like, why would it be any different with podcasting? You know, like there's going to be people that are all kind of in the same lane, but just kind of doing their own little tweak and variation of the same thing. You know, like it's
Hmm.
going to happen. You just have to, you know, one, do the show because you want to do it in the first place. Two, not be worried about what other people are doing. And three, just find your own little particular thing that makes you. I mean, you may have this totally the same type of show as somebody else, but you just got to find your one little tweak or niche that makes you different than the other ones, where it's like you can be in the same vein, but you kind of have your own little thing that you're doing, you know?
Yeah. I think the ones that are the most popular, I've noticed they're more PG rated. I was like, eh, I try not to cuss a whole lot, but at the same time, I don't edit anything. So if someone drops an F bomb here or there, I mean, it's whatever. And if anyone listens to our other podcast, that's where my co-host and I are stupid because we literally can't talk without cussing every 5 seconds.
That's me too. Like it's hard for me to censor myself when I go on shows. So already apologies on the aspect of I probably should have asked before we started about swear words because I know I've dropped like at least two F bombs. Not obsessively, but it's just it naturally comes out in my speech. So it's like I can't help it. So I just one of the problems I feel with a lot of podcasts is that they try to be something they're not. And realistically, people want people that are true to themselves. So like some people are PG and that's them. That's what they do. But other people aren't. And it's like if you try to pretend to be PG, it's just not going to be true. You know, you just have to be
Mm-hmm.
yourself. And whatever it is what it is. And people are going to like it or they're not. And it's that's just how it's going to be. Like, I know that I could probably get a lot more listeners if I stop swearing, but it's like I wouldn't be true to myself at that point because I do swear when I talk. Like, even to the point where it's like, you know, I swear around my kids. And some parents have that whole thing about the taboo of like, oh, you don't swear in front of kids, you don't do this, you don't do that. Like I don't swear at my kids, of course, but because of me swearing and talking the way that I do around my kids my entire life, like I could tell my daughter to say the F word and she wouldn't say, not that I would do that because I'm not one of those parents, but you know, she wouldn't say it because she understands that it's a bad word. So it's like one of those things that you can keep people away from something. Um, but it's just going to make it more taboo for them. If you just put it out in the forefront, then they just don't have an interest in it because that's just how things are.
Yep.
I
That's
mean,
how
like
I
I'm
that's
a
how I am
cannabis
too.
cultivator, so it's like I don't lie to my daughter about that, but because of that, she's not going to be sneaking around when she's a teenager and trying to smoke behind my back because it's not going to be a taboo thing to her.
Mm-hmm. That's having a preteen is very eye-opening experience. I'll just leave it at that.
It already
So,
only imagined.
mhm. So that's been a real awakening for me and my wife, but we're dealing. And but just in general, no, like I don't sit here and tell anyone, oh, you can't say this, you can't say that. It's pretty much free reign. And again, I know a lot of people like, oh, you don't cuss on this. I keep it clean. I've been on other things where they're like, oh, we try and keep it clean. Make if you say something, just pause, pick back up, we'll edit it out. I'm like, I don't do any hardly editing. So if I don't have to edit anything, I'd prefer not to. So like whatever gets said. And at the end of the day, it's like it is what it is because I'd rather have free conversation with people and give them a place to be comfortable and talk rather than trying to predetermine what can be said and what can't be said. The only thing that doesn't get said, which doesn't really matter on this one, but our other podcast, there was a specific thing that happened like 3 years ago when the world kind of went crazy for a little bit. You can't mention that word without it causing the algorithm to start censoring on YouTube.
Yeah.
So we call it the beast era.
That's a good terminology for it. See,
Yeah.
I'm like the opposite end of the spectrum. I just say it. So it's just like I kind of have the idea that like if you just flood it with people saying that, they can only censor so much, you know.
Well, they
Plus,
completely banned one of my videos, and I
see,
already
that's
got
why I
warned on
don't usually
YouTube.
do too much with YouTube. It's like I'll post clips of the show on YouTube and TikTok that are like 3 minute clips, but like I'd never post the full show on there because I already know it's gonna get taken down. So it's like at least if I do like the 3 minute clips, I know it's safe, and I'll just upload it over there and push everybody the RSS feed because RSS is like outlaw radio, man. You can say and do whatever the hell you want. Like
No,
just a matter of making sure you're not on like Spotify, for example, that probably has the means of pulling your episodes. But if you're on some like other RSS host, like they can't pull you off of every single thing. Like, it ain't gonna happen. They can pull you off of one thing, but you'll just be up on iTunes. If they pull you off of Spotify, if they pull you off of those, you'll also be on Podcast Addict, or you'll be on Amazon or whatever. It's like harder to regulate stuff when it's not just in one place.
no. I use RSS.com as my actual, I guess distributor. I don't know, my hosting platform or whatever you want to call it. And they put the videos on YouTube. They put them all out there on all of the actual streaming services. So it's like I don't really do anything for it. So I don't even have to create the videos anymore. They do everything for me. So it's just like whatever. I just upload the audio and I'm basically done with it. So
I mean, I've thought about doing those, but like I look at the numbers and everything, and at least for me, like a podcast is a podcast. It's intended to be audio. So it's like I don't get why people want to watch like a video of just somebody sitting in a chair and talking for 2 hours.
I don't
So it's
even,
like I just do
I,
the clips. I feel like
yeah,
that's just a little bit easier digestible for people instead of having to stare at my face for 2 hours because everybody not intentionally talking bad about myself, but I don't like the way I look on camera. So I definitely like having just a voice of radio.
yeah, I definitely have the face for radio.
I feel like most of us do. That's the nicest way of putting it. We definitely
No,
got good voices though, because that's half the battle is that you have to have a podcast voice that people want to listen to. But it seems like all the people that have the best voice, their face doesn't match the voice. It's like that whole scenario that what was that movie? Not Step Brothers, Grown Ups, where all the girls are fantasizing about that guy that's like the lifeguard or whatever, and then he
he's
comes
got
up to
that
him and
weird
yeah,
voice.
he's got the high pitched voice. He's like, "Hi girls, I'm from Sketch Cartoon." I'm like, "Oh shit."
Yeah, I remember
But then the girls on the phone sex lines that are like, "Hey baby, how's it going this evening?" Like that they're probably not the most attractive people in person, but they got a great voice though. That's why they're doing phone sex instead of doing like chat rooms, for example.
that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got the voice for the phone.
Exactly. Which is a very easy trick. You just talk a little bit deeper and quieter and closer, and I think you got a pretty seductive voice going. I should start doing a podcast late night. If anybody wants to come and get a back rub in the night. Sorry, I'm having a little bit too much fun with that.
No, that's really going down the dark side tonight.
Would you like a virtual massage from a podcaster? Call 1-800 Hot Podcast. You got to bring some light to these dark topics.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think we can probably wrap this one up now that we've went off the rails.
A little bit. Usually on Bizarre Encounters, we call it Bizarre Encounters After Dark. So you guys just got a little snippet of Bizarre Encounters After Dark.
But no, I definitely appreciate you coming out here and talking with us tonight. It's been a good entertaining one. Sometimes it's I just sit back and listen, but it's good to have someone to actually converse with, kind of knows the struggles of podcasting and everything.
Hey man, I always like the opportunity to talk with people about the struggles of podcasting in a way, but being a host of a show, I don't necessarily always get invited to be guests on the show, even though I feel like I do have some stuff to talk about at least. But it's always an honor to get invited to be on a podcast. So it's been an honor getting to be on your show in the first place. And yeah, just thanks again for inviting me in the first place, because I always like being able to interact on other people's shows besides just always having everybody on my show. But then it's like, again, I'm the host usually on my show. So it's like, I almost feel like I talk too much when I'm a guest, but I guess that's kind of the point, right?
Makes my job easier. Even on my
Exactly.
other podcast, I let my co-host do most of the talking. I'm just like, I'm just going to sit here and just check levels, make sure everything's going good.
I mean, I started off that way when I first started my podcast, where I just kind of sat back more. But then after a while, it's kind of like you get into your comfort zone, and it's like I kind of feel like I'm more me on the show than I am anywhere else. So it's just like once I get in my comfort zone, I end up talking a little bit too much. But hey, that's why I do Bizarre Encounters, and we just deep dive, and it isn't just an interview back and forth show. But I mean, I guess Inquiry is kind of the same. It's like kind of like this. It's like the one-on-one back and forth. Like there's more than two people. It like gets harder to interact, I feel, unless it's like people you're comfortable with, you know?
Mm-hmm. We did a live stream probably a little over a month and a half ago, and I had like, I think 10 people, 8 or 10 people were in it from the other one, the other like band guys stuff. I figured that one was going to go crazy chaotic, but it actually was like pretty cool, pretty maintained. We actually had the cameras on, everyone was on a camera and everything. So we called it the roundtable discussions. So I've thought about doing something like that maybe for this podcast here eventually, but I would have to find people that were actually wanting to come on and actually talk. It's
The
hard enough to find one person, let alone more than one at the same time.
dude, the hard part about roundtables is trying to find a perfect group of people where everybody gives an opportunity to talk. Because half the reason I don't do a lot of roundtables is because you always have that one dominant voice that'll just end up talking over everybody. So it's like it's really hard to find that good dynamic where it's everybody kind of gets a turn to talk and nobody's talking over each other. Because there's been a lot of roundtables that I'm on where it's just like you'll be talking and then somebody will just start talking over you and like take over the room. And it's like, yeah, it's like I don't want to do a roundtable with this guy. But in general, just a random piece of advice, not to tell you how to run or do anything. But if you did a roundtable on this side of your show, I would try to word it as not a roundtable because I feel like it throws a lot of listeners off because they know the typical idea of a roundtable. So they try to avoid that. So like if you do a roundtable, you got to find a different terminology to call it. Otherwise, people are just going to see round table and just,
Hmm. Yeah. I
because
haven't really,
I'm guilty of that one. I'm being honest with you. Coming from a listener, like when I see round tables, I'm kind of like, eh. But if somebody like words it differently, then it's like, okay, let's check it out.
yeah. I don't know how it would work with this one just because the band stuff was easier to do because everyone, they're all in bands. There's a lot of things to talk about. But if I talk to people that have had experiences, it's like almost what would be the middle narrative, like the meeting for everyone to have in common? You know what I mean? Other than, oh, we experienced something, but maybe this person saw aliens, and this person saw a dog man, or this person saw Bigfoot fighting a dog man. Who the hell knows? And it's like there has to be some sort of common ground to it. I think it'd be harder to pull off with this type of podcast.
I mean, try to find a theme. I mean, like, even if it's just like cryptid encounters or UFO encounters or paranormal encounters. I mean, if you could, all dogman encounters or all Sasquatch encounters, but at the minimum, at least if you kept it like cryptids, aliens, UFOs, whatever, you could probably do a little bit more of like a round table back and forth because then in turn, people can kind of start talking about their beliefs on different phenomenon and this and that. And it just kind of opens the doorway for a lot of different opportunities within it. But you kind of have to keep it like within the same category of phenomenon unless there's like combining factors, like you could have like UFOs, aliens, and Sasquatch, but the common thing between these is that everybody saw orbs beforehand, and then you can kind of get into like, oh, where could these orbs be and shit like that. You just have to find like a leeway to like set stuff up. You'd be surprised at like what stuff you could bring together with just having like a common piece with it.
Mm-hmm. And that'll be something further down the road. I actually have to start recording new episodes for the other podcasts. We got so far ahead on that one that I neglected this one. So I've started doing episodes of this one. Now I've started neglecting the other one. So it's hard to keep both of them consistently going.
I mean, I feel you there, man. I drop one episode of Bizarre Encounters a week and two episodes of Inquiries, and I had to get to a point where it's like I have specific days for certain things. Like Bizarre Encounters is always Friday, Inquiries of Our Reality is always Monday through Thursday, and then Saturday, Sundays are my off days with the family to hang out and all that. You just have to balance and get on a schedule with it, and that's a good way of like being able to keep up on both shows, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm going to end up doing is I'll set like Tuesdays and Wednesdays for this one and maybe like Thursdays for the other one. Because the other one, we don't need to get so far ahead like we did. We literally hammered out 45 interviews in like a 3-month span.
Like I said, man, if you just keep like 2 weeks ahead and then you just record one episode a week of each of your shows, man, you should be able to stay on top of all of it. That's kind of the game that I've been running lately. I just
Yeah,
have specific days for the shows, and that's my best advice on how to keep two shows running at once.
that's what I've been trying to do. But well, Shane, I definitely appreciate it. If you want to tell everyone one more time where they can find you at, and then we'll roll on out of here.
Well, depending on which show you guys want to look up, I do put everything under link trees to try to make it so that all the links are in one place. And for anybody that's not familiar with what link trees are, it's pretty much like you go on Linktree and it'll have your Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, all that stuff all in one place. So I put everything under that. But the link for it is LANKTR.ee/. And then if you're looking for Increase of Our Reality Podcast, after that is Increase of Our Reality Podcast. If you're looking for Bizarre Encounters, it's that link and then Bizarre Encounters. And if you're looking for all the stuff I do all in one place, you guys can just look up Open Minds Media, which is same thing with Linktree, and then open_minds_media. Or all you guys could go on Instagram, which is the form of social media that I'm the most active on. You look up Increase of Our Reality, Bizarre Encounters, Open Minds Media on Google. I should be the top ones for that. But I'm all over every different streaming platform. I'm all over Instagram. So just look up one of those three names and you'll end up finding the other two off of that. So that's probably the easiest, quickest way of doing it.
Right on. Well, again, thank you very much. And we're rolling out. So good night, everyone.